toxic leaders who are up before dawn and do some sort of weird pre-dawn rituals around eating bizarre things and insane workouts, and they send emails pre-dawn as well, and they're angry that people aren't responding even though it's 4 in the morning. They're angry that people aren't showing up and being available to them around the clock, and that aren't maintaining the narcissistic leader's obsessive zeal and devotion to this bizarre level of work and discipline. Let's talk about getting future frozen. And this is something that specifically happens in work. So let's take this on. I have no doubt some of you have gotten future frozen and you don't know about it. So like I said, you thought future faking is bad in the workplace. The future stuff is even worse. It's very specific what I'm about to talk about, but I'm very certain that what I'm about to talk about has happened to more than a few of you. You have a narcissistic boss or supervisor or manager or mentor, someone in that capacity. You work for them. You work hard for them. You're very good at your job. But it's a job or a company or a business or an institution where there are opportunities for advancement. You can get promoted, which may mean if you get these opportunities for advancement, you might get more advanced positions, you might get a salary raise. These changes may mean getting moved to a different division, a different office, even a different region, or certainly a different arm of the organization. But ultimately, it may mean that you do not work for your narcissistic boss anymore. In some cases, you may not have clocked your boss as narcissistic initially. You might have simply thought that your boss was exacting or demanding or perfectionistic. Some of you may have even gone so far as to think this was an opportunity to learn from someone, especially if your boss was some kind of hotshot or really, really good in what they did. You may have had a strong work ethic or simply be smart and good at your job, but you may have also been very ambitious and seeking something more. Some of you may have detected that your boss was narcissistic, but also believed that working hard will get you ahead, or that someone would take notice of it, and there would be an opportunity to grow within the organization. All very reasonable things to expect. So the selfishness of the narcissistic boss, like with any narcissistic person, it knows no bounds. And so here is how it often goes down. If you're really good at what you do, a narcissistic boss doesn't want to lose you. You are making their life too easy. You may be doing your job uncomplainingly, keeping your eye on the prize, believing that if you do well that you will be advanced. Because they are narcissistic, they have zero interest in your growth or your potential. They only know that with you around, and they feel entitled to you being around, by the way, that it's better for them. And the narcissistic boss may also be so distorted in their self-appraisal that they think that they are the great one, and not that things are running smoothly because of you. Heaven forbid someone else get the credit for how things are going. But at some inherent level, they do know that they need you, and they are not going to let you go. Much like a narcissistic parent who feels entitled to their child doing what they want and almost believing that their child owes them something, and that for a lifetime that child should be meeting or anticipating their needs, and the child, and even into adulthood, is labeled as selfish or greedy or ungrateful for wanting to be their own person. Something similar happens with the narcissistic boss. The narcissistic boss feels entitled to you as well, and that pattern of subjugation shows up in the same way in parenting relationship as it does in a work relationship. With a narcissistic boss, you exist for them, for their career, and they will label you as selfish. Or if you try to get ahead in your career, that you're getting ahead for yourself. And how dare you try to strive for more. So this takes us to this whole future frozen part. And this is actually pretty effed up. The narcissistic boss, supervisor, mentor, whoever they are, will actually hold you back. They may tell you that you are not ready to advance, even though you are, and they may future fake you and tell you that the team just needs to get past some made-up deadline or benchmark, and then you can talk about it. They may lie to you and tell you that there are no advancement opportunities opening up anytime soon. What they're doing to you may even be more severe, and they may even actively stop your opportunities to get advanced. For example, you may actually attempt to network and be proactive in the workplace, and they will get the word out to stop that somehow. They may imply that you're being ungrateful, selfish, or even showing hubris at wanting to advance. So if you have even an ounce of imposter syndrome, it will play on that. The narcissistic boss who's future freezing you may also take the future faking to a cruel level and lie to you about how they're going to talk to other people in the organization to ensure that the right people know about you, but they never do. And the final insult in all of this is that they may actually try and block you when you try to leave the position and seek out a new one. And you may actually not have the kind of letter of reference you deserve because they won't give it to you, or you have to do your new job search secretly. And if it's a small industry, this can be very tricky because someone is very likely to talk and say how you are looking for a job, and it'll probably get back to your narcissistic boss who is trying to freeze you and keep you with them forever. As all of this happens, you are future frozen. And it's important you be aware of this dynamic, because you could end up stuck in it for a very long time and may miss real opportunities to advance in a timely manner. I personally, with a couple of narcissistic bosses, have almost gotten future frozen twice. And the people who remained in the job, interestingly, are still future frozen. However, I've also experienced the alternative, a job in which the folks around me and who were my bosses were really good people who told me, you can be bigger than this. We love you, but it's time for you to get a PhD and go on to the next level. So the question becomes, how do you avoid being future frozen? First, you have to know what narcissism is, how it shows up in the workplace, and that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you know the rest. You need to ask for ongoing performance reviews so you have evidence of your performance, and save records of any work product you create, and that's all those kinds of things, whatever that looks like in your industry. You also need to do your homework on what has happened to people who have worked with this person before. Are they still there after years and kinds of languishing? Did they move on, and what did that look like for them? Make some tentative inquiries and ask about what happened to the people who came before you, but do this carefully so it doesn't get back to the narcissistic boss. You need to find a genuinely supportive, non-narcissistic mentor separate from the narcissistic boss. Ask them how long one should stay at your level and get some guidance from them on what advancement should look like. As with any narcissistic relationship, bosses are no different. You need to radically accept and recognize that if you have a future freezer boss, they will not make it easy for you to leave. And if you have a history of other narcissistic relationships in your life, especially narcissistic parents, the boss's manipulations and telling you things like how you're selfish or ungrateful for leaving the job may bring up uncomfortable feelings of guilt and shame. It's important that you also make some quiet inquiries about other jobs. Perhaps in some cases, you may even consider going off on your own and starting something entrepreneurial. But keep it all under your hat, because as soon as the narcissistic boss hears about it, they are going to try and shut it down. And if you try to distance yourself and go off and be your own person in the workplace, you got to be prepared for smear campaign type stuff, or at the very least, that the narcissistic boss may foster and share a skewed narrative about you. Don't get into the mud and just keep working the way you are. Just document the hell out of everything. In these situations, don't get tempted by a hoover. For example, your narcissistic boss offering a significant pay raise or the promise of a better title or the like. It is still going to keep you in the subjugated space, and it will always be about them. And unless you are comfortable with being the professional equivalent of your narcissistic boss's butler for the rest of your career, don't fall for it. Whatever they're dangling in front of you, including money, may be very tempting. But the individuation, autonomy, and pursuing a career path that isn't about making them look good is even more valuable, because it'll allow you to develop in an authentic manner professionally, and you can't put a price on that. And remember, you are probably why the narcissistic boss looks so good to the world. There is some schadenfreude in watching them hanging out there once you leave the job and them trying to figure it out without you, because it becomes very, very, very apparent very quickly at how much of their success was happening and it was being grown on your back, even though you weren't being recognized. I am sure some of you have seen the film The Devil Wears Prada. And in that film, there is the assistant who endures a difficult year or so of working for the very narcissistic boss, with the assumption that you do a certain amount of 1 or 2 years in this job and you go on to advance. But even in the films, it seemed like none of the assistants advanced. I guess maybe the big dangle was that they got to go to Paris Fashion Week just to be further subjugated. But the fiction of the film became clear when the highly competent get anything done for this boss assistant, Andy, decides that she's had it, and she tosses her phone in a fountain and blows her narcissistic boss off in Paris. And she gets back to New York, looks for a new job, and finds out that the narcissistic boss has reached out to the new employer that Andy has gotten a job at, or is interviewing at, I should say, and has given Andy a glowing reference. That's the sort of fiction that messes people's heads up in narcissistic workplace situations, because that is not how that story goes down. Hollywood always wants to give the narcissist a happy ending, probably because there are so many narcissistic folks in that industry, and they want redemption. But I have known people who have been in 20 to 30 year future frozen careers, and it's terrible to witness. Smart, diligent, hardworking people who could have developed out their interests in so many different ways and had so much more freedom if they weren't under the thumb of a narcissistic person who has frozen them into eternal obligation with fake promises, and the job isn't even pleasant while they're doing it. If your hard work is making the trains run on time, but it's not being recognized through growth and respect in the workplace, real respect, not nonsense about, wow, you're such a good team member, here's a certificate, not that. Or is being recognized through appropriate advancement opportunities. That's not happening. Take a long, hard look around and how you are being kept stuck simply because you are making someone else's life easier. And remember, how would the end of The Devil Wears Prada have gone if it was really a movie about real life? The narcissistic boss would have been vindictive and made sure that Andy didn't find a job for a while. That's the real world. How when this is happening in your real job, it can take a significant toll on your future and on your mental health and leave you future frozen. Are you being gaslighted at work? We are too familiar, anyone watching this channel certainly is, we're all too familiar with being gaslighted in our close relationships or in our family relationships. Being told we didn't say stuff we said, or do stuff we did, or being told stuff that didn't happen that did, and that we are insane. It's the core of every narcissistic relationship. But what about at work? Gaslighting at work can be maddening, and it can really hurt our careers. Let's talk about some classical ways that people are gaslighted at work. Number one, you do the work and it is not acknowledged, or someone else gets the credit for it. This can be particularly galling. We know that narcissistic workplaces are triangulated workplaces, and that means the favored employees may get credit for doing very little, or even for the work that you do. At first, you may be shocked. Over time, you will get angry, And if you push back on what's happening, you may be painted as petty for needing credit, and yet you may know that that might be the only way to get advanced or get a raise, and it may even affect your paycheck if you're doing all this work and it's not acknowledged. It can be very confusing until you understand it, and over time you may find yourself getting anxious knowing that the credit for your work will be stolen, and that obviously can leave you a lot less engaged in the workplace. Number 2 way of knowing you're gaslighted at work is when they constantly move the goalposts. Your schedule may be changed without your consent, or your designated vacation time moved around. And you will be convinced that you had a certain schedule planned around it. And the supervisors or leadership may straight up lie or tell you that you remembered your schedule wrong. Obviously, this can wreak havoc with your life. Once again, if you push back, you may get feedback like, this is the job, you need to be flexible. In essence, pathologizing you for simply wanting a fair answer. You may be more than willing to work hard, but having the basic parameters moved around, like schedules, and then the switch in your schedule being denied is gaslighting, and also makes it impossible to have any kind of a life. Number 3 is making it about the greater good. And if you try and push back, they will accuse you of not caring about the team or being a good team member or not caring about the clients or the mission and the vision. So imagine that you have been very devoted to your workplace and doing good work there for years, making sacrifices when you needed to, but over time, financial needs or just wanting to be appropriately recognized, just on par with what was happening in your industry, lead you to advocate for yourself, ask for better working conditions or better pay or flexibility, whatever it is you need and have earned. And instead of your ask being acknowledged, instead you're met with, well, I guess you just no longer care about the mission or our clients or whatever it is, the lack of commitment they're implying. You feel insane because you know you have made numerous sacrifices over the years for the team, for this employer, and simply asking for basic recognition so as to be on par with others at your level is completely denied. Number 4, you are mysteriously left off of important email chains. Everyone else gets the email, and it was an important email, but you find out about it when someone asks you a question and you give them a, huh? It may result in you missing a deadline, a meeting, some other important information, or just leave you feeling lost. I remember a colleague once not being told an out-of-town meeting was canceled and found out on his way to the airport. It also can be expensive. When you ask about it, you may be met with minimization and it wasn't that big a deal or it wasn't intentional. And yet, you may still be getting the other inconsequential emails that go to everyone else, just not the important ones, and yet, when you bring it to anyone's attention, you're the one who's painted as something wrong with you. Number 5, the usual gaslighting stuff, right? Colleagues or supervisors who deny they said what they said, or that you after you were promised something and it wasn't delivered to you, you're told that it never happened, or it was never promised, that you're being dramatic, what's wrong with you, that sort of stuff. Again, it can leave you feeling as though you are losing a grip on reality at work and leave you feeling more inefficient at work. Sometimes these pseudo-promises are made as part of a larger future faking play. This is urgent. We need this done right away. And after that, we promise you're going to get this. You promise you're going to get that. And then you hustle and you get the urgent thing done. And then the promised thing doesn't happen. You did your part. They didn't do theirs. And then they deny the promise. It can feel really awful. Number 6 is that claims about equity and diversity that just simply aren't true. You may notice that things are being done inequitably wherever you work. Advancement, raises, opportunities, favoritism in the boss's inner circle, not advancing diverse people in the workplace. But then the employer will turn around and say, we're committed to an equitable and diverse workplace. And when you push back, you may be met with, we're equitable. So any challenges with advancement, and if you're not getting advanced, must be your fault. Despite you turning in excellent performances, you then doubt reality because you're doing good work. It's not being recognized. Number 7 is when folks are having to take the blame for a leader who'll say, I never said that. You may have actually been part of the group that acted in accordance with what a narcissistic leader says, everyone might, and then when the organization faces any kind of fallout from that, it's the people who executed the orders who may get nailed and not the person who issued the order. They will fall on a, I never said that, or you misheard that. The leader is willing to let, then, the narcissistic leader is willing to let the employees take the fall. Gaslighting in the workplace means that everyone is simply taking the fall for simply following the leader's recommendations and orders, and the leader may often end up protected. Gaslighting can absolutely do a real number on you in the workplace, and you really do waste time figuring out what is going on because your reality is being doubted regularly. It can make work tremendously stressful, anxiety-provoking, unsatisfying, and lead you to lose any pleasure you get from work. You might find yourself ruminating about the confusion and the gaslighting as well. So, what do you do about this, right? Well, number 1, you gotta document the hell out of everything. There's nothing you can do in a workplace without documentation. You also do things like you avoid having meetings alone. You build alliances with trusted associates, so at a minimum, hopefully you know someone has your back. Having a mentor who can remind you of best practices or expectations and salaries in your industry is important. After being gaslighted for so long, you may not even know what's right anymore. And it doesn't have to be someone who works in your company, just someone to be sort of an anti-gaslighting force who knows the industry in the midst of a confusing workplace. And at some point, you may just have to call it quits. Some corporate or organizational cultures are simply irreparable. And just like narcissistic people don't change, neither do narcissistic cultures. Life is too short and work is too worky for us to be gaslighted at work. Don't let it happen. And that idea of narcissistic workplaces being awful and triangulated and you being gaslighted is simply not good for your health. Now, I'm going to be honest. One of my hobbies is actually to read the news, as much news coverage as I can, of bosses and boss-type people, celebrities, and other people who have a lot of power and who publicly then ultimately get called out for their abusive treatment of those who work usually in a more subordinate position to them. Oftentimes, these are people in sort of high visibility or high power professions like entertainment, finance, politics, high visibility, slick industries. Now, in the vein of Me Too, we now see that there's more of a voice and someone will finally speak out. And then we finally hear in the news the stories of harassment, assault, people throwing electronic devices at other people's heads, and people slamming stuff down, obsessive compulsive control of the office environment, public humiliation and degradation, employees quaking in fear and living with a litany of health issues after having had to work under these conditions. Then the whole post-mortem begins, right? And the layers of the onion begin to get peeled back. There will be those who were abused by this narcissistic person and who come out of the shadows and share their stories. And there will always be that small pocket of enablers who will defend or slightly defend what happened, saying things like, well, like, all right, let's face it, this company was so big because they had exacting standards. And they held themselves to these standards and had the pressure of carrying this excellence on them, which means that sometimes they were less than graceful. Well, that's a nice spin on it. The enablers would come up with gentle ways of framing the abuse. Again, putting lipstick on a pig. Abuse is abuse. But when it comes to the narcissistic abusers themselves, that is where the excuses become most fascinating. I have said this time and time again on this YouTube channel. Part of the reason we have such a systemic and global issue with narcissism is because narcissistic people are often extremely successful. They are often obsessive and exacting about details and work, and even about their work ethic. Because frankly, for narcissistic folks, work is a much easier, more consistent, and more predictable way to get narcissistic supply, money, and power than human relationships are. And if all of that goes well, if their work goes well, work brings money, which brings power. And as a result, they will rise to the top of organizations or begin their own organizations. And as leaders, they really work within the cult of personality. People are drawn to that, and they tend to build cult-like structures around them. There is sometimes a sort of culture that is characterized by revering and pushing for who can work the hardest. Like, oh, I work 20 hours, oh, I work 22. And these are often workplaces that have sort of hazing rituals naturally built into them. But the narcissistic person's success is often something that they hide behind, and sadly, is something that often draws people to them. Sort of like one of those big risky things that I hear, like a little like red flag I hear about, was when it comes to people who get harmed by extreme workplace narcissism, is the draw that they initially may have had to working in a prestigious or promising or otherwise fancy place, whether it be a company or a startup or a hospital or university. There must be the hope that that fancy job might launch their dreams, make them rich, or prepare them for bigger and better things. They'll be able to say, hey, look, I worked at fancy place. And too often in these places, there are difficult, toxic folks. Yeah, they get the job done, but with a body count. Now, when the narcissistic abuser in these big cases, or honestly, even in the small cases, finally gets called out, they will issue an apology, maybe, or at least a mea culpa, right? Because their attorney or their publicist tells them to do so because it's better optics, and say something like, quote, I recognize that some of my behaviors may have caused discomfort for staff and employees. It was never my intention. This is a competitive industry, and I felt I was never asking them to do anything more than I was doing, but I can see now that my behavior was not considered acceptable. That kind of sort of canned apology. But stuck in there is that idea that I expected them to work the way I was doing it, work as hard as I was doing it, at the standards I was. Now, before people get caught in their behavior, let's say you actually try to take this up with the narcissistic person who's behaving like this. You may actually be hit with colleagues or leaders who will say, I'm not asking you to do anything more than I am. But these toxic leaders miss the point. Maybe these leaders are in fact working as hard or even harder than the other people. The difference is that these toxic people, that the people who are getting hurt by this are having to work while being abused. The toxic leader has the luxury of working hard without a person invalidating, manipulating, and humiliating them. They get to be in control of how the workplace runs. Many of these stories will involve toxic leaders who are up before dawn and do some sort of weird pre-dawn rituals around eating bizarre things and insane workouts, and they send emails pre-dawn as well, and they're angry that people aren't responding even though it's 4 a.m. They're angry that people aren't showing up and being available to them around the clock, and that aren't maintaining the narcissistic leader's obsessive zeal and devotion to this bizarre level of work and discipline. But this narcissistic excuse is not limited to the workplace. It is also an issue in families and relationships. A narcissistic person, for example, may shame their partner and say, hey, when you work as hard as I do, I expect nothing different from you. And that sort of rhetoric will be an excuse for them making unreasonable demands around the household. A narcissistic parent may have some sort of bizarre Calvinist work ethic and constantly invalidate and berate their children, their partner, or both for wanting to pursue their own interests, or at a minimum to just spend time in a more balanced manner or have some leisure time and tell them, hey, I expect you to do as much as I do. And that will then become an excuse for their verbal abuse that you aren't working as hard as I do. I'm not asking you to do anything I don't do. Because narcissistic people are so outcome focused, for example, money, power, dominance, and they're very egocentric, they tend to take impeccable care of themselves, but at the expense of the others around them. They can be obsessive in everything they do, whether that's work or leisure. And because they view others as objects that exist for their gratification or for their needs, they do not take note of how their behavior is impacting other people's health and well-being. Shaming people for not producing, not working, not doing becomes their way of rationalizing abusive behavior in all kinds of relationships. This pattern also explains why many people will equate working hard with getting love. This idea of trying to measure up to an impossible and almost abusive demands for productivity, and then having that behavior excused by the narcissist's proclaimed hard work. Hey, I work as hard as you do, is often just too much to bear. But maintaining that sad and hopeful belief that if I just do enough uncomplainingly, they will finally love you. They won't. For narcissistic people, all of us are just means to an end. It ends up becoming an abusive stew of shaming, their excusing of their own behavior, and magnifying our own sense of not being enough that makes this excuse uniquely painful. So the next time they say, hey, I'm not asking you to do anything I do, and then that becomes the excuse for their abusive treatment, abusive words, invalidation, throwing things, screaming at the workplace, again, all things unreasonable. It's again, there are no excuses for abuse. So when you hear this idea, well, I'm doing it, so you should do it, doesn't excuse the abuse. Maybe that they've set a tone for a work ethic. That tone can be set without harming other people. Now, anybody out there who has ever worked with a narcissist or narcissists knows the havoc that they can wreak in the workplace. Triangulation, harassment, abuse. They don't carry their load. They accuse everyone else of having it easier than them. They will backstab colleagues. They will steal ideas. They will pass rumors. They will deny the things they say. They will gaslight everyone. It can be a mess. Again, any of you have had these workplace experiences, and you can do so safely and confidentially, drop it, but don't do it if it's going to cause you problems at work. People will report that after working with a narcissist, it can result in workplace stress like no other kind of workplace stress. I mean, all workplaces are a little stressful. And this is particularly stressful if you don't know what you're dealing with in terms of a narcissist. If you also have legacy issues related to narcissism, such as a narcissistic parent, these dynamics can be even more activating for you. Or if you're in a narcissistic marriage and working in a narcissistic workplace, you may even find yourself vacillating between feeling trauma bonded to your abusive colleague or boss, or experiencing traumatic stress in the face of narcissistic abuse from a boss or even a colleague. Because it is the workplace, you may minimize it. You may gaslight yourself and say, it's just my job. I need to stop taking it so personally. But given how much of our lives we spend working, or in some cases in the workplace, it can have the same level of physical and mental impact as an intimate relationship or a family relationship. In most ways, narcissists get away with way more nonsense at work. Their competitiveness, their grandiosity, their obsessiveness, their entitlement, their obsession with winning, their willingness to brag about their accomplishments, all of this can contribute to them actually climbing the ladder more quickly, because many people may not see these patterns as toxic. They may see them as hardworking or focused or ambitious. And narcissistic individuals are so skilled at looking good to those they need to look good for and to destroy those who get in their way, that they often rather quickly ascend the ladder into leadership, and narcissists may actually crave leadership positions because they like the supply and the power that comes from being the boss, whereas other people might say, forget it, I don't want the headache. Narcissistic individuals are about power and profit, and that is a motivation that many employers can get behind. Narcissistic individuals are not team players until someone is watching, and their Jekyll Hyde slickness means they can trick many people, especially somewhat dull-witted people at the highest levels of corporate leadership who don't quite get these patterns. So they climb to the top and are making other people's lives miserable. But not all workplace narcissistic abuse happens from the top down. Sometimes it can be one of the rank and file workers, the frontline worker who is passive aggressive, manipulative, and may be a real handful for managers, who treats clients badly, and may be protected by workplace rules that make termination very difficult. These frontline workers may also make everyone's lives more difficult by fostering sort of a demoralized workplace. And because people often just don't want to be bothered with the toxic shenanigans of a difficult coworker, they just don't want to deal with them. Everyone else may be working harder, so they don't need to take the difficult person on or ask them to do something. Many employers enable the narcissists in their midst. HR departments don't know what to do about them. HR is woefully unprepared in most organizations. The fact is, narcissists are geniuses at leaving the psychological bruises that nobody can see. Workplace reports about them, when you do try to make change, often devolve into he said, she said, they said. And the absence of documentation, not much can be done. And I'm going to tell you, even with documentation, I cannot tell you how many times human resource departments, management, and administration will soft pedal it into, it all just sounds like a misunderstanding. We can try to find common ground, or some other consultant nonsense talk. And they'll often try to dodge lawsuits and with settlements and moving people around within the company, so they may not any longer need to work closely with each other. But what none of these entities are ever willing to do with the narcissist is to pull the weed out by its roots. The fact of the matter is, narcissism is not against the law. And because of that, employers' hands are often tied. Many times, employers will also minimize and gaslight it as a stylistic difference between two employees. And if the narcissistic employee is profitable, they may not want to either kill the golden goose or aggravate or piss off an antagonistic employee who they think is going to sue. So the healthy people become the sacrificial lambs. One thing companies and institutions don't think about when they enable narcissists and when they permit the toxic workplace to just keep going is the talent drain that they're going to face. It's my hope that as more people get educated about narcissism and narcissistic abuse, that they recognize that they cannot win at this game. Some people really give it their best shot. They manage expectations, they radically accept, they don't defend, they don't explain, they don't engage, they don't personalize, they follow all the steps. They really try. But the narcissist, despite you figuring out the workarounds, will still generate a toxic culture around themselves. And it's just bad energy to be in that. The possibilities for growth in these kinds of workplaces are often curtailed. You may not feel like you can even be authentic in your workplace. I understand. It is a real luxury to be able to leave a job, and most of us cannot leave a job unless we have another gig set up. It's just the nature. We got to pay the bills every month, right? But once you realize that there is a narcissist in your midst, start the job hunt. It's often the best play because, frankly, the therapy bills, even if the new job doesn't pay as much, still might outweigh the cost difference. Because even if not everyone can leave a toxic workplace, over time, there will be a talent bleed. Some of the good ones will leave. The empathic ones, the compassionate ones, the ones who are gritty enough and willing to take on a little bit of an extra load because it's the right thing to do, because they have a shared vision with their employees and employer. But it gets tiresome when you do these things and it's never reciprocated. Employers can lose productive people, healthy people, and the people with integrity and who are honest. Then, when that happens, when that talent drain happens, what you're left with is a critical mass of the narcissist and all of their minions, the people willing to do the narcissist's bidding. And it becomes a big, dysfunctional family characterized by triangulation and all kinds of ethical lapses. And it feels more like the reality show Survivor than it feels like a workplace. And when you get to that point, it can be very difficult to keep your company or keep any company or for a company to keep going. See, it's the healthy people that kept that workplace going and alive, even as they were being jabbed by the narcissist. Many a company, institution, or business, large or small, has been brought down by the hubris of narcissism. And anyone could see it coming, except for the enablers and the deniers on the inside. The talent drains that come when a workplace is toxic cannot be underestimated. Some companies get to try, at least try, or something achieve, holding on to their good talent by overpaying them. It's kind of like blood money for putting up with the toxic narcissists in their midst. Some hold on to jobs that are toxic because of handsome pensions or other golden handcuffs that will await them one day, or that they're stuck into, I should say. But in a more nimble economy, and as the days of working 40 years for a pension and a gold watch fade into the history books, people leave jobs more often. Millennials, for example, are switching jobs quite a bit. It's the nature of the new workplace. I have watched people, though, try to make a toxic workplace work, and one day it hits them. Maybe it's just an absurd staff meeting that just feels like the theater of the absurd. Maybe it's watching the most toxic person get advanced and get accolades, and watching the real workhorses remain unseen. Maybe it's watching a junior colleague enduring the same toxic hazing ritual you endured 25 years prior, and it becomes that wake-up call that nothing ever changes in this place. Many times when people leave, they just leave. They never sit down with HR or management and say, you know why I left? I left because of the toxic culture that was allowed to be fomented here. They just get out and try not to look back. So reliable statistics about all of this can be quite hard to get. But companies do lose talent. And one day the people in charge, who may be toxic themselves, may look up and wonder, what just happened? And here's what's interesting. They'll never see it clearly, and in fact, may label the people who left that company as ungrateful or weak. People who leave toxic companies, frankly, often go on to great things. They create their own firms, which they really set up intentionally to be non-toxic. They may be more discerning and may choose a new job on the basis of the quality of the people who they get to work with. And there's also a resilience that develops from working in a toxic workplace that you can bring forward. As the world increasingly keeps enabling toxic and narcissistic behavior, always remember there is a toll. You can keep pretending like all the gaslighters do. Oh, come on, it's not that big a deal. He's not that bad. But as more people understand this phenomena, they will leave. And trying to run a company that's populated by only narcissistic employees and their enablers, well, that's a fool's venture. The enablers are too busy validating the narcissist to really do their jobs, and the narcissists are too busy manipulating everyone and burning bridges to do their jobs in a sustainable way. As a business model, it may work for a little while, but in the long term, all those burned bridges means that there is no way to keep moving forward. Listen, I hope someday we see a world, a sort of alternate universe, in which the healthy people will finally prevail, that we will have reasonable workplace policies that can actually call people out for toxic behavior, that we don't gaslight people who are saying this doesn't feel okay by saying, oh, just don't make such a big deal about it. That's just how he is. I do hope that day comes. I'm not holding on to it, the idea that that might happen in my lifetime. And so we may not see massive corporate, institutional, or large business change, but for those of you who are running smaller to medium-sized businesses, take a good look around and really sort of do, I don't know, just like you might do quarterly reviews, do a quarterly sort of assessment of the level of toxicity in your workplace. Ask yourself if you're keeping someone around for reasons of nostalgia, misplaced loyalty, and not really accounting for how they're treating other people. Because one day you're going to look up, and I promise you the good people will leave. It's my goal through the work I do in education is to give the good people the wake-up call, to leave the toxic spaces that the people who are in the toxic spaces don't want to fix. There's an incentive to doing it better. It's on all of us to see if we can hold up that sort of, that kind of standard for employers to engage in. But until then, plan on watching the talent just bleed right out. Thanks again for tuning in, and please subscribe if you're new to this channel. Hit that notification bell, and we'll always remind you almost every day when these new videos come out. Thanks.